Thank you very much, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here, and it's especially wonderful to welcome you to the first performance in Canada of this piece of Walter Braunfels' The Birds. Of course, it received a performance on Monday night, but this is officially the opening night, and you are here, so welcome and congratulations. It is, of course, been a tradition now at Pacific Opera for many years to present something that, shall we say, is off the beaten track at some point in the season. And this work has a surprising and, in fact, somewhat puzzling production history. But I thought I'd start with giving you a little bit of background about what I would call the world of Walter Braunfels, a German composer. By that I say he wasn't Viennese, the way so many German composers end up being. He was born in Frankfurt, he died in Cologne, and spent a substantial amount of time in Munich, where this opera was first presented. So he was born in 1882. Let's look at that year for just a second. That's right around exactly the same time as Anton Webern, as Bela Bartok, as Igor Stravinsky. He would pursue a path that really had nothing to do with anything that they did. And if anything, to my ears, it's apparent, and it's apparent in his biography as well, that his influencers remained pretty staunchly Richard Strauss, perhaps even more than that, Richard Wagner, and in many ways a composer who was not rigidly but fervently conservative and anti-modernist, Hans Pfitzner, who actually gave us an opera about the Renaissance composer Palestrina. I don't know whether we'll ever do it, but it was something that, that Braunfels sort of clung to for most of his life. He wasn't a composer who wanted to explore the arcane reaches of 12-tone composition that Schoenberg invented, or even some of the more nationalistic works of Stravinsky and the modernist works of composers. He was resolutely somebody who I think wrote music that he thought people might like to listen to. Now, the first thing to say about him beyond that was that he was born into a very musical family. We can't really count his father as an influence because he died when the boy was only 3. But his mother, I don't know whether this name will mean anything to you, she was related to Louis Spohr, who when he wrote in German was Ludwig Spohr. He wrote a setting of Erlkönig, for anybody who knows that song of Schubert. So most importantly, I think for us, she had at some point in her life played with Franz Liszt. So she was acquainted with him, and she had a daughter who studied piano with Clara Schumann. So renowned names of the later part of the 19th century. And the young son took an interest in piano, probably first before composition. And he pursued piano, and he loved to improvise, and he loved to make up tunes. So he had an upbringing that was not that dissimilar from many a young composer. But to sort of hedge his bets after this very promising start, he pursued a university degree in something like economics and law. This was around 1901. But he continued to perform and improvise even while he was doing this. In that, he resembles a composer who was successful many years earlier, somebody named Robert Schumann. So I guess law kind of, actually Handel went to university to take law too. It seems to have a repellent effect on most aspiring composers, if anything. So in any case, Braunfels went and visited his family in Munich in 1902 and was introduced to a host of musical luminaries, one of whom allowed him to come to rehearsals of Wagner's Ring and Tristan und Isolde. And this basically intoxicated him so greatly that he realized he couldn't really entertain the idea of pursuing a career in anything but music. And he did, unlike other composers, continue to develop as a pianist to the point where he was quite well known as a pianist. But also he cultivated composing, and he was a man of the theater. So to move on from that, in 1913, he began composing this work that we know as The Birds. He had always thought of himself as an ardent student of classicism. So Aristophanes, the author of the original comedy, The Birds, was somebody he knew pretty well. Now, most of us will have had some exposure to the classical allusions and themes that permeate the tragedies of ancient Greece and of classical Greece. But the comedies are a different thing altogether. not dissimilarly to Shakespeare's, and even not even somewhat the same as the ones we encounter today, comedies tend to poke fun at existing situations and people. So they tend to be topical. They tend to worry or concern themselves less with universalism and eternal thoughts. So it's not surprising when we go to Aristophanes and we read that he's actually satirizing quite effectively and quite pointedly the politicians of his day, the thinkers of his day, the influencers of his day. And of course, to most people in an audience today, those names don't really mean very much. We can probably say what happened to Oedipus, although we won't in polite society. And we can also say what Medea did to her kids. But we generally don't think so much about what was happening politically. What were the hot potatoes then? God knows we've got enough of our own to deal with. So this work is loosely based on Aristophanes rather than a sort of faithful adaptation of it. And it uses the metaphor of the birds and their behavior alongside the idea of human intervention into the world of the birds, and also perhaps human opportunism, as you'll see. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes. I want to sort of finish him off a little bit. So this work premiered in 1920. So he began it in 1913 and it didn't premiere until 1920. Well, that's because the Great War intervened. Something similar happened to Berg's Wozzeck. He began that in 1914 and it didn't get on stage till something like 1924. And I suspect both of the works are somewhat difficult to put on to begin with. But in 1920, The Birds was a great success. The musical language is really not at all like Alban Berg. Yes, it has some dissonances and it has even little bits of polytonality. That's when you put two keys together like Stravinsky liked to do. But on the whole, it's really quite accessible music and it's really quite accessible harmonies. I'm not saying this because I don't think that you're capable of comprehending complex and dissonant music. I know you are because most of you have come to all the shows. But this has something a little more innocent to it, at least until it's not supposed to. So it was a great success. And not too many years after it opened up, Braunfels was introduced to a young statesman who had enjoyed it very much. Not at the time, I think, a really well-known one, not as well-known as he is. But anyway, I'm talking about Adolf Hitler. And Hitler asked Braunfels if he would be interested in writing an anthem for the Third Reich. And he refused this quite indignantly. What Hitler didn't know at the time was this very delightful music that he liked so much was written by somebody whose father was Jewish. So that was eventually, of course, disclosed. And in 1933, 13 years after the success of The Birds, when Braunfels was really quite lionized as both a composer and a performer, and also was well employed as a teacher in Cologne, he was essentially gotten rid of. Now, I don't mean that in the ultimate sense. It's puzzling to me that, in fact, he was allowed to live in a place in what was called isolated. There is a word for it, but we don't. Just in his own house, in his own place. He was not allowed to work or appear in public in any capacity whatsoever. But he wasn't persecuted beyond that. But whatever Hitler might have thought of the piece when he first heard it, as soon as he found out about the genetic makeup of its composer, it was derided as decadent music, degenerate music, and so it wasn't allowed to be performed anywhere. Now, ironically, during Braunfels' period of exile, he continued to compose, and he actually wrote a substantial amount of chamber music, which to my ears sounds like it brings in yet another influence to his work, which is, of course, Johannes Brahms. He wrote string sextets and some of the things that Brahms cultivated so successfully. And finally, in 1948, he was permitted to pursue his career again, and his works were brought back to the public. A couple of things that happened, which I'm going to make sure you know about when we look at the actual piece. But for whatever reason, his work was no longer seen as fashionable. It didn't court the audience in the way they wanted to be courted. And of course, in 1948, we were moving pretty quickly towards kinds of music that were, if anything, alienating to the average audience member. We were well past 12-tone composition of Schoenberg and well into the complete world of Anton Webern, which will dominate the academies of the 1950s. So Braunfels had a kind of bittersweet welcome back to society because he just didn't seem to be relevant anymore. Horrible word, that. And when he died in 1954, he basically slunk into obscurity. And the next production of The Birds didn't take place until 1971, which is a long time after, isn't it? And the next performance after that was 1991. So it's taken quite a while to bring this work back to the public's eye. I sure hope you'll agree with me that that's a shame, and you'll also feel grateful as I do that we get to see it in our local house. And not only see it and hear it, but experience it. So a few little things about that. So I mentioned that The Birds is kind of an allegory. Timothy actually put it this way: it doesn't really have a plot. It does actually tell a story, but not in really a conventional way. So it begins with the nightingale. The nightingale has often been thought of as a bird that has to do with love, or a bird that has to do with purity, and in Mahler's case, often a bird that foreshadows death. But in any case, the nightingale begins the prologue. And in the prologue, she sings and she imitates what obviously would be birdsong. And if there's a role that she sounds similar to, it is unquestionably that of Zerbinetta in Ariadne auf Naxos by Strauss. You'll hear echoes of Strauss if you're familiar with that opera, or with Salome even. It's not as rib-tickling as Salome is. Nobody kisses the lips of a freshly severed head, but nevertheless, it's still powerful. And I don't want to go on and on about the influences, because of course this is very personal music. It's written by a composer with a fully developed, unique personal voice. But as with most composers, you can hear hints of other composers' generosity in their influences. So then we will meet the first two characters. I have to get my own plot out, because they are generally referred to by their German names. I'll use my program. I don't need to. Ratefreund and Hofegut. There, I got those two out. Basically, Ratefreund means loyal friend, which he isn't quite. And Hofegut means good hope, which he is. So they have become, and this is a little bit underplayed in the libretto for this piece, which was by Braunfels himself, as opposed to the play. They have become disenchanted and disillusioned with humanity, and scornful of it, and sort of feeling cast away, like they want to go find something better. So they have trudged off into the land of the birds. I like the fact that in Greek tragedy and comedy you can do things like that. And so we feel their kind of disenchantment and their desire for something new. And so they stumble onto this sort of colony of birds, and they meet what we could describe as the king of the birds, who is Wiethopf or Hupo. And he's the leader. He's a sort of self-appointed leader, and he's getting kind of bored with his role. So he's vulnerable to an influence which might be described as opportunistic and not particularly free of other kinds of interest. And so the young men find out that far from entering the kingdom of the birds, they've entered a society that has no kingdom. And so the world of the birds is actually just a matter of putting down roots wherever they can. And a great deal is made of how much the gods owe them. And the idea that Ratefreund has is that they should actually build themselves a citadel or a fortress in the sky. That always rings in the back of my head a little bit. Would they call it Valhalla maybe? They don't. But it's something that somewhere where they can live that is in between the earth and the heavens, where the gods are. And the purpose of this would be to help them gain independence, because the citadel would prevent the smoke that is part of a burnt sacrifice from reaching the heavens, where the gods can thrive on it. It's said that the gods, if the smoke does not reach them, will wither and starve. And so the birds will gain an advantage over the gods. 2 seconds to answer this question. Do you think this ends well for the birds? It actually doesn't, and perhaps does. When we learn lessons the hard way, we're supposed to benefit from them. But in any case, the first act ends with this idea that Ratefreund has essentially created, that will upset the order of the universe by having the birds and helping the birds make this citadel as an act of aggression against the gods. Okay, so a person who joins in with this reluctantly is Good Hope, Good Hope, because he's not 100% convinced that this is actually going to work. He tries to talk his friend out of it, but in the end feels that perhaps this could lead to a new world, to something that's gratifying. Now back to the Nightingale and her solo at the very beginning. She sings with the voice of a bird, so there's a lot of rapid high passage work and a lot of vowels and trills on vowels. We'll hear that in the chorus as well. And you'll see in their costumes that they're made up to look like various kinds of birds. Ultimately, there will be a wedding, and those are not birds so much as puppets. Did anybody see either the live play or the movie War Horse? The live play was fantastic. Remember those puppets? So it's a little bit like that, but not 100% as spectacular. So watch for that little bit. So they are literally birds. But the idea that our director had is to start the whole thing off in the trenches of World War I, where Braunfels spent time, and then it sort of comes out of his imagination quite fluidly. But the Nightingale refers to something that has weighed on her. Something that not anybody knows about, something that was an unpleasant experience that has left her incomplete. You'll find out what she's talking about at the beginning of the second act. Now, in the second act, we are reminded that in 1917, say 4 years or so after the composer began work on this piece, he had a dramatic conversion. Now remember, in the German-speaking world, you may be Jewish, but you could ingratiate yourself or at least make your way into the path by becoming a member of one of the Protestant religions, which is what Braunfels and his family did. But in 1917, he converted to Catholicism. And into the play, into the opera, in the second act, is inserted what feels like a little bit of preaching. And certainly a very dogmatic speech comes from a character named Prometheus. And we learn from Prometheus that he was once a man. He comes on stage to deliver a fierce warning to the birds about the vainness, the vanity and futility of interfering with the gods. It reminds me of another character that we've seen on this stage. Do you remember the sort of earth goddess who comes up from the earth and sings, "Wotan, beware"? Remember her? Okay, well, she's not in this opera, but Prometheus has a little bit of that too. And he's going to tell you in a wonderful aria, Scena almost, about the effect of, or the consequences of betraying the gods. And he did that when he was a man, and he'll describe the punishment levied against him by Zeus in German, and it's pretty awful. I'll let you find out when it's being sung, because it's much better than me telling you about it. But it would probably persuade any of us to just not go that route. And Hoffagut is quite convinced by this, but Rathenfreund isn't. Rathenfreund insists that this is all ridiculous and that they should go ahead and do what they'd planned to do. They built the city, and they go against the god, they defy the gods, and of course a huge storm ensues. All of this is absolutely magnificently rendered in the music. We've had the wedding of the two birds, completely different music, and then we have a period like the last movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, except in this case it's not thanksgiving to the gods for being kind, it's a hymn of praise to the gods. So again, a little bit of a hint of Braunfels' fairly newly acquired Catholicism comes into that. And then we have the difference between our two earthlings, which is Rathenfreund, loyal friend, is completely unchanged and unaltered in his personal view of the world by what has happened, by this cataclysm he's experienced. He basically says, oh, whatever, I'm going back to the world of the humans, and off he goes. But Good Hope has had this, what would we call it, encounter with the Nightingale. They've discussed things, and he has asked her earlier in the act if she can help him see and hear the world through the eyes of a bird and the ears of a bird, and she does this. She's reluctant, but she does it, and she kisses him. And this innocence is something that he begins to experience, and this wonder at the phenomena of life, and it has changed him forever. And I'll tell you the line when I play a little bit of the tune. I'm going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to play a little bit of this music, but the score is ferociously difficult to play on the piano. You'll notice in the program a reference to Perry Lowe. There's also a photo of her and her work so far as a répétiteur. And she was able to take this opera on while our usual repetiteur, Kim Bartzak, is still on mat leave. So she learned this whole thing and could play it. I think it's astounding. So I'm just going to play little bits and pieces of it, and I'll describe them as I play them. So just give me a sec to get to the piano. So this is from the very, very beginning. This is the first thing you'll hear, although played on instruments other than the piano. Now, to me, that sounds pretty much like a Richard Strauss song, doesn't it to you? So, I'm going to play you some of her singing. She does a lot of ah, 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 and trills, like they always do in bird music. But then she sings this. Now she does this note, and I'm going to get you to sing it after I've played this passage. That would be enough, I think. That would be your audition. And so her notes go very high, and they're meant to be very fluid and very effortless. So if you are familiar with Zerbineta's role in Ariadne auf Naxos, this will remind you of it. Now, I'm jumping all the way into the second act and the scene that features Prometheus. And this is when he's beginning to tell the birds his story of what happened to him after he defied Zeus. And he says to them, listen, my little children, have you heard of Prometheus? And thus it begins like this. I gotta get record. Now that to me sounds like a great audition aria for somebody who wants to do his first Wotan. And throughout that it sounds that Prometheus has this kind of characteristic of a Wotan. And of course Wotan was a flawed god. So you'll see the storm, you'll see the birds scream and run away from the conflagration that they themselves instigated. You'll see all the business with Ratafreund basically giving up. I want to play you now I want to play you first of all the hymn of praise that the birds sing, because this settles absolutely into something that we can recognize as liturgical music. And they're singing, "Great and mighty is Zeus." Again, choral music that sounds, in its the orchestra particularly, as if it could have been by Wagner. And again, I don't want to harp endlessly, although I guess that's what I'm doing, on the influences, but it is part of the world that he remains involved with. Now, to me, the most fantastic ending that I've seen in many operas, it's one of those few where you haven't found yourself wishing that it would end sooner. It just happens to end in a purely organic way after Loyal Friend has left, Ratafreud has left, and Hoffagut is on his own, or Good Hope, I'm used to saying. And he's contemplating what happened to him in this. Was it a dream, he says, when he had this encounter with the nightingale that changed him forever? Did it happen? We see ourselves getting gradually back into the world of the trenches. And I think that the opera has the best last words that I've ever heard in an opera. So first of all, this is his questioning when he's saying, did this really happen? This is the orchestra, clarinet. And he says, is this all there is? Did I dream this? Is this all? Did this mean nothing? Now, the thing about German operas, of course, as opposed to many Italian ones, is that the orchestra is playing its own music. It goes beautifully with the voice, of course, but it's not playing anything like this ever. So it's very hard to play the voice part and the orchestra at the same time. But I do want to have what is at the end. Now, there is singing after we've heard this line, but it's the nightingale, so there aren't words. The last word is when it dawns on him what's happened to him during that period of his encounter with the nightingale and his understanding of the world of the birds. He says, I have lived. So the last word is lived. Where will I play from? And lebt, the word for lived. And very shortly after that, a little bit more song from the nightingale and the curtain closes. One can easily see why this was such a big hit and why it was such a success and why people liked it so much to give it 50 performances in I believe its first season. So as I said, you are the first audience other than the students that came to the dress rehearsal, which it was. We actually, the orchestra had to stop at one point and fix something. So you're the first audience to see this. And let's hope that other companies take on this challenge, which it is a challenge. So thank you very much for coming to the opening night of The Birds. Timothy did feel compelled to let people know at one of our presentations. Folks have been coming up to him and asking him if this has anything to do with the Hitchcock movie of the same name. And it doesn't, so you don't have to be afraid to go back in the shower after you've seen this. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the show.